Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On October 15, 2015, at 19 hours and 42 minutes, a sharp sound broke the silence on the outskirts of Newcastle, Virginia. It wasn't a gunshot or a scream, but the usual vibration of a cell phone, coming from the depths of a rusty dumpster near an abandoned gas station. The place was avoided by the locals. The broken asphalt, the smell of fuel oil and rotten leaves created an atmosphere of complete hopelessness. The district police detective, who had arrived using the coordinates received from the cyber department, carefully pushed aside a piece of rotten cardboard. Among the household waste and dirt was a small bundle that glistened in the flashlight. It was aluminum foil, carefully wrapped in several layers of polyethylene. When the policeman cut through the plastic, the screen of the iPhone 5 smartphone glowed with a cold white light. There was only one photo on the screen, taken just 2 hours before the device ended up in the trash. What the detective saw made him hold his breath. The picture was of a woman who had disappeared exactly 1 year ago and was presumed dead. She was kneeling in a grave-like pit, emaciated to the point of skeletonization, with a shaved head and a heavy chain around her neck. But that was not the most terrifying thing. In the background, leaning on a shovel, stood her best friend. Healthy, clean, and with a subtle, eerie smile on her face. This image turned an accident case into one of the most brutal investigations in the state's history. On October 15, 2014, the morning in Virginia was cool and foggy. A car with 3 passengers pulled up to the parking lot at the beginning of the Dragon's Tooth Trail hiking trail. This place, known for its steep, rocky peaks and difficult terrain, attracted hundreds of tourists. But that day, the forest seemed particularly gloomy. Old friends got out of the car. 28-year-old Rose Washington, 30-year-old Sherry Green, and their peer Karen Williams. Their friendship has been going on since college, although life has taken them to different spheres. Rose built a successful career as an architect with the city of Roanoke, while Sherry worked as a nurse in the intensive care unit, saving lives. The third was Karen, a yoga instructor. For the past 6 months, she had been acting strangely, avoiding loud companies, rarely answering her phone, and living a withdrawn lifestyle. However, it was Karen who initiated this trip. She insisted on a so-called cleansing hike. No phones, no internet, no communication with the outside world. Just the silence of the mountains and unity with nature. At 8 hours and 15 minutes in the morning, the group was spotted by a ranger at the information stand at the beginning of the trail. In his report, he would later note that the women looked well prepared. They were wearing professional trekking shoes and carrying backpacks designed for a 3-day overnight hike. The ranger exchanged a few words with them about the weather forecast, warning them of possible wind on the ridge. The women nodded, tightened the straps of their backpacks, and started deeper into the forest. That was the last time anyone saw Rose, Sherry, and Karen alive. The alarm was raised only 5 days later, on October 20, 2014. Rose Washington, known for her punctuality and responsibility, did not show up for work at the architectural firm. Her phone was turned off. That same evening, Sherry Green's parents contacted the police, saying that their daughter was supposed to return on October 18, but never got in touch. Roanoke County Police immediately reported the women missing. A large-scale search operation began at dawn on October 21st. Dozens of police officers, U.S. Forest Service rangers, and hundreds of volunteers combed the dense thickets of the Jefferson National Forest. Helicopters equipped with thermal imagers took to the skies and circled the Cove mountain range for hours, trying to capture the heat of human bodies among the cold rocks. However, the dense tree canopy and difficult terrain made aerial searches almost impossible. The first, and perhaps most surprising discovery, awaited the investigators at the very beginning. The women's car was parked in the same parking lot where it was last seen. It was locked, the tires were intact, and there was no external damage. When the police opened the door, there were no signs of a struggle inside. No blood, no scattered items. The interior looked as if the passengers had left for a minute and were about to return. However, an inspection of the glove compartment changed everything. The detective who conducted the search found Karen Williams' driver's license and passport. They weren't just lying there. The documents had been torn into small pieces, turned into a pile of plastic and paper trash. Next to them were her bank cards, neatly cut in half with scissors. It didn't look like a burglar had done it, because the valuables were still there. It looked like the ritual destruction of one's own identity, a conscious rejection of one's name and past life. This detail added an eerie tone to the case, turning it from a simple disappearance into something much darker. The second strangeness occurred during the work of dog handlers. The dogs picked up the trail of the car and confidently led the group of searchers up the main trail. But not to the top of Dragon's Tooth, where accidents often happen. The trail broke off much earlier, near an inconspicuous, overgrown with shrubs branch. This old trail was not marked on any modern tourist map and led to a network of abandoned logging roads that had not been used for decades. The dogs circled in place, whining, but refused to go any further, as if the women had simply vanished into thin air or gotten into another vehicle at this particular remote point in the forest. Weeks passed, and the forest did not give up its captives. Search teams checked every crevice, cave, and ravine within a 10-mile radius, but found not a scrap of clothing or trace of a fire. By December 2014, hope of finding the women alive was lost. The official search was called off due to deteriorating weather conditions. The police put forward two main versions. The first is an accident. The women went off the route, got lost, and fell into a hard-to-reach gorge where their bodies were covered with snow. The second was a crime, an encounter with an unknown vagrant or criminal who used the remoteness of the forest to attack. But there was no evidence to support either theory. The case of Rose Washington, Sherry Green, and Karen Williams was given the status of hanging. The files with the investigation materials lay on the shelves of the archive, covered with dust, and the Jefferson Forest plunged back into its centuries-old silence, hiding the secret of the three friends. It seemed that this story was over before it began. But exactly 1 year later, a phone call would force the detectives to reopen the case. On October 15, 2015, exactly 365 days after the silver SUV last entered the parking lot at Dragon's Tooth, the case that most detectives had mentally buried took on a new, shocking twist. The Craig County Sheriff's Office was in the midst of its usual routine, with officers filling out reports on petty thefts and traffic accidents, and the old air conditioner humming monotonously to disperse the stale air. This tranquility was shattered at 14 hours and 12 minutes when a call from the state's cybercrime unit came through on the special communications line. The voice on the other end of the line sounded tense and unnaturally fast. The officer on duty who answered the call initially thought it was a mistake, because what he was told contradicted all laws of logic. Rose Washington's cell phone, an iPhone 5, which was thought to be turned off, discharged or destroyed a year ago, suddenly appeared online. An electronic monitoring system set up to search for the device's unique identifier detected an active signal. It was like a call from the other side. The device didn't just turn on for a moment. It was steadily pinging the nearest cell tower, transmitting its exact coordinates. However, the signal was not coming from the deep forests of Jefferson National Park, where the three women's tracks had been lost a year earlier. The dot on the map was pulsating on the outskirts of Newcastle, Virginia, 20 miles from where they disappeared. The detective in charge of the investigation immediately alerted the task force. The situation required an immediate response, as the phone's battery, which had been unused for a year, could run out at any second. The technicians warned that the signal had been going on for 2 minutes. Time was running out. Police cars with their sirens on were racing through the county's broken roads, kicking up clouds of smoke. Every second of delay could cost lives if Rose was still alive and trying to call for help. But at 14 hours and 16 minutes, exactly 4 minutes after it came online, the signal disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. The monitor screen in the cyber department went black again. The coordinates led the team to a drab industrial area on the southern edge of Newcastle. It was a place where construction debris and old cars were dumped, a neighborhood of forgotten warehouses and rusting hangars. In the center of this wasteland stood a long-abandoned Blue Ridge fuel gas station. The sign had faded in the sun, the windows were boarded up, and the asphalt was cracked and overgrown with weeds. There was not a single living soul around. The silence of the place was heavy, oppressive, as if the very earth itself was hiding someone's dirty secrets. The detectives, weapons at the ready, began to comb the area, focusing on the latest geolocation data. The dot pointed to the backyard of the gas station, where several overflowing garbage containers stood. The smell of rot and chemicals was unbearable. One of the containers, covered in rust, was half filled with bags of construction waste. The officers began to carefully dismantle the rubble. At a depth of about 2 feet, among the fragments of drywall and old rags, the detective noticed a strange object that stood out from the general picture of chaos. It was a small bundle that glistened in the rays of the autumn sun. Someone had carefully, almost with surgical precision, wrapped the object in several layers of thick food foil and wrapped it with thick black polyethylene and tape on top. Investigators immediately realized the purpose of this design. It was a crude but effective Faraday cage designed to completely block radio signals. The phone had been in this cocoon for a long time, isolated from the outside world. The person who threw it there did so deliberately. They unwrapped the foil, turned on the device, and threw it in the trash, knowing that the police would pick up the signal. It was not a gesture of desperation, but a cold-blooded message. The find was immediately handed over to forensic experts who arrived at the scene in a special van. The phone, a white iPhone 5 in a transparent case, was in surprisingly good condition, with no scratches or cracks. Its battery was on the verge of complete discharge. After connecting the device to an external power supply, the specialists began the procedure of cracking the password. The tension among those present was growing by the minute. When the lock was removed, the detectives leaned over the small screen with bated breath. The call log was empty. There were no messages. The photo gallery, which had once likely contained snapshots of Rose's happy life, had been scrubbed clean. All the old photos had been deleted. Only one file remained in the phone's memory. One single picture. The metadata indicated that the photo was taken today, October 15th, 2015, at 12 hours and 15 minutes, exactly 2 hours before the phone ended up in the trash. What the police saw on the screen made even veteran criminal investigators recoil in horror. The image did not look like reality. It resembled a scene from a horror movie. But unfortunately, it was real. In the foreground, occupying most of the frame, was Rose Washington kneeling. But it was almost impossible to recognize this creature as the former beautiful architect. She looked 10 or even 15 years older. Her face was emaciated to the point of a skull, covered with earthy skin. The thick, dark hair she had been so proud of was roughly shaved off in shreds, revealing a head with numerous abrasions. The woman stood in a deep, damp pit, knee-deep in mud. A heavy, rusted industrial chain hung around her neck, its links embedded in her thin collarbone. Her eyes looked into the lens, but there was neither hope nor fear in them. Only emptiness and boundless fatigue of a person who had already crossed the line of insanity. But the real shock was caused by what was happening in the background of this horrific portrait. Behind Rose, on the edge of the pit, stood another figure. It was a woman, and she stood in stark contrast to her captive. She was dressed in clean, neat clothes made of rough, unpainted cloth, similar to the outfits of farmers of the last century. She looked healthy, strong, and well-fed. Her hands were calmly clutching the handle of a shovel, the blade of which was stuck in the fresh soil. The woman looked directly into the camera. Her face radiated absolute calm, and a subtle, eerie half-smile played on her lips, which made her blood run cold. The detectives recognized her instantly, even though their minds refused to accept this fact. It was Karen Williams, the friend who had been mourned all year as an innocent victim of an unknown maniac. Now she stood over her friend's grave not as a hostage, but as an executioner. Dear friends, before we continue to unravel this tangle of mysteries, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and write any comment. Your activity is a signal to YouTube's algorithms that this content is worth watching. It is thanks to your likes and comments that more people will be able to see this video, and this story will not go unheard. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, and now let's get back to the investigation. A single digital file found in a dumpster instantly overturned all previous versions of the investigation. The theory of a lone maniac or a random vagrant who attacked 3 defenseless women in the woods crumbled to dust. The photograph clearly demonstrated the horrific reality. Karen Williams was alive. Moreover, she looked healthy, free, and, most frightening of all, in control of the situation. The shovel in her hands and her calm gaze indicated that she was not a victim, but an accomplice, or even a jailer, of her former friends. This discovery made the detectives look at Karen's personality from a completely different angle. The investigative team immediately requested full access to all archival files related to Karen Williams' life before her disappearance. If earlier the police had been looking for traces of external enemies, now they began to look for ulterior motives within the group itself. An analysis of the woman's financial activity gave the first alarming signal. Bank statements showed that exactly 1 month before the fatal hike, Karen had made one large transaction. She closed her savings account, transferring all of her savings, an amount of $40,000, to an account of a little-known organization. The recipient of the payment was a non-profit organization called Rooted Path, which means rooted path. Further investigation revealed that this organization was registered in the name of Silas Vance. This name did not mean anything to the detectives. It did not appear in the criminal databases. However, the legal address of the organization, indicated in the registration documents in the city of Richmond, turned out to be a dead end. The operatives who went to the address found only a mailbox office in a shopping center. The Rooted Path existed only on paper, with no official office or staff. a classic sign of a sham structure or closed sect. While financial analysts were looking into the cash flows, cybersecurity experts were working with the same photo found on the phone. The image metadata was preserved. The global positioning system coordinates pointed to a specific spot on the map, located deep in the middle of Blacksburg County, right on the border with West Virginia. It was a remote, mountainous area, rarely visited by casual travelers. According to cadastral maps, this land once belonged to an old sawmill that had ceased operations in the 80s of the last century. Now this territory had the status of private property and was known as the Evergreen Sanctuary, or the Sanctuary of the Evergreens. The owner of the land was the same foundation to which Karen had transferred her money. Detectives contacted colleagues at the local Blacksburg County Police Department to learn more about the location. The information they received was disturbing. The officers reported that the sanctuary was a gated community that lived by its own rules and categorically refused to have contact with the outside world. Among the locals, this place had another unofficial name: Farm of the Silent. The farmers whose land bordered the territory of the former sawmill told strange things. They claimed that from time to time, trucks with construction materials and products would drive by, but no one had ever seen anyone leave. Drivers delivering goods said that they were met by armed men at the gate, unloaded in complete silence, and ordered to leave immediately. The territory of the sanctuary was turned into a real fortress. The perimeter is surrounded by a high fence with several rows of barbed wire stretched over it. Video surveillance cameras are installed at the corners of the site, and the only entrance is blocked by a massive metal gate. None of the locals dared to approach the fence, as there were rumors of aggressive guards and vicious dogs. It was the perfect place to hide people so that no one would ever find them. Having received this information, the detective realized that they were dealing not just with a kidnapping, but with a well-organized structure. Karen Williams didn't just lead her friends into the woods. She led them into a trap she had prepared in advance, paying her entrance fee of $40,000 and 2 human lives. The police began to prepare a search warrant and mobilize a special forces group, realizing that they would not be able to enter the territory of the silent farm peacefully. But they did not even suspect that right now, at this very moment, behind the high fence, preparations were being made for their visit. On October 20th, 2015, at 5:30 in the morning, the fog over Blacksburg County was so thick that visibility was no more than 10 yards. In this pre-dawn gloom, a convoy of 10 black Federal Bureau of Investigation armored SUVs and 2 heavy state police SWAT vans moved silently down the dirt road to the gates of the Sanctuary of the Evergreens. The operation, codenamed Dawn, was being prepared in strict secrecy. The leadership understood that any leak of information could lead to mass suicide of the sect members, or the destruction of hostages, if they were still alive. At 5:45, sniper pairs took up positions on the wooded hills around the perimeter of the estate. Through binoculars, the observers saw a grim picture that resembled footage from documentaries about labor camps. The territory of the former sawmill was built up with 3 long wooden barracks covered with rusty slate. A little further, at the edge of the forest, stood an old, leaning barn with its doors nailed shut with crossed boards. In the center of the complex stood a 2-story main building, renovated and fortified like a command bunker. Despite the early hour, life in the sanctuary was already in full swing. People were working in the fields surrounding the residential buildings. About 24 figures, dressed in identical baggy gray clothes, were silently tilling the ground with hoes. Their movements were mechanical, devoid of any personality. They did not speak to each other or even raise their heads. Among these gray ghosts, the agents tried to make out the familiar faces of Rose Washington or Sherry Green, but in vain. The women who disappeared a year ago did not work in the field. This increased the anxiety of the assault team leaders, because the lack of visual contact could mean the worst. At 6 o'clock, the silence was broken by the roar of stun grenades. An armored bear vehicle demolished the massive metal gate, clearing the way for the assault teams. Agents in full tactical gear burst into the courtyard, shouting, "Federal agents, get down on the ground!" The reaction of the commune residents was unexpected. The men in gray did not run away or fall to the ground. They simply froze, heads down, and continued to stand like statues, ignoring the chaos around them. Only the guards resisted. 2 men in camouflage, who were on duty at the entrance to the main building, raised their hunting rifles. However, their intentions were immediately suppressed. The snipers opened fire on their weapons and legs, and within seconds, both guards were neutralized. The assault team, hiding behind ballistic shields, moved toward the porch of the main building. The doors flew open from the ramming, and the special forces filled the corridors of the first floor. Inside, the main house was strikingly different from the squalid barracks outside. It was cozy. Expensive carpets, antique furniture, the smell of incense and freshly brewed coffee. On the second floor, in a spacious office overlooking the mountains, the agents found their main target. Silas Vance, the 50-year-old leader of the sect, sat in a deep leather chair. He was a tall man with gray hair and a piercing gaze, who, according to former followers, was able to subdue the will of his interlocutor in minutes. He preached the idea of renouncing the ego through suffering, convincing his followers that pain was the only way to purity. Vance did not try to escape and did not reach for a weapon. He looked at the armed men with poorly concealed disdain, as if their presence was just an unfortunate obstacle in his grand plan. But the biggest shock for the operatives was the person standing next to him. Karen Williams stood by the leader's chair with her hand on his shoulder. The woman whom the police were looking for as a kidnapping victim looked absolutely calm. She was wearing a clean linen dress, her hair neatly tied back, and a wooden amulet, the symbol of the Rooted Path organization, hung around her neck. When the officer ordered them to raise their hands and kneel, Karen didn't even move. Her gaze was clear, but there was no recognition of reality. She looked at the special forces as if they were foolish children who had broken into a church. According to the report of the capture team commander, Karen did not physically resist during the arrest, but her words silenced even experienced agents. When the handcuffs clicked on her wrists, she spoke quietly but clearly. "You do not realize what you are doing. You are interrupting the process of redemption. We are almost there." Silas Vance and Karen Williams were escorted out of the house and into different patrol cars. Vance remained silent, maintaining his mask of a haughty prophet, and Karen continued to whisper prayers or mantras while staring at a single point. Meanwhile, the main part of the group cleared the barracks. All the residents were detained, but there was a strange apathy among them. No one asked for lawyers, no one cried. These were people with broken psyches who had lost the ability to think for themselves. However, the main question remained unanswered. Rose Washington and Sherry Green were neither in the main building nor in the barracks. The perimeter was completely under control. Every bush and every corner was checked. The commander of the operation reported on the detention of the leaders on the radio, but his voice sounded alarmed. If the women were not among the living residents of the commune, it meant that they were being held somewhere separate, or the police were too late. The attention of all the operatives involuntarily shifted to the last unchecked building on the territory of the complex. An old, dilapidated barn stood off to the side, at the very edge of the forest, and its massive door was locked from the outside with a heavy padlock that looked too new for such an old structure. The old barn, which stood at a distance from the main house and the residential barracks, looked like a relic of a bygone era. Its wooden walls were blackened by time and moisture, and the roof had caved in places, revealing rotten rafters. However, the massive padlock on the front door looked suspiciously new and reliably guarded what was hidden inside. When the commandos cut the shackle with hydraulic shears and pushed open the heavy door, they were greeted by a thick smell of mold, old hay, and something sweet like rot. The beams of tactical flashlights cut through the semi-darkness, snatching piles of rusty farm implements, old machines, and bags with unknown contents from the gloom. At first glance, the room seemed empty and abandoned. However, the service dog, a German shepherd named Rex, began to behave restlessly. The dog was pulling his leash toward the far corner of the barn, where a large wooden platform stood, piled high with old tarps and boxes. The dog handler signaled to the group, and the two agents began to dismantle the blockage. Under the pile of junk, they found a square outline in the floor, cleverly disguised as ordinary floorboards. It was a hatch covered with felt for soundproofing. When they lifted it, the cold and stench of sewage came out of the black hole. A steep wooden staircase led down, disappearing into complete darkness. The team began to descend. What they saw below resembled a medieval prison or the hole of some predatory animal. It was not just a pit, but a whole system of hand-dug tunnels and earthen chambers reinforced with rough logs. The walls were damp, water was dripping from the ceiling, and the floor had turned into a viscous mess of clay. There was no electricity, ventilation, or sewage. The air was so heavy that it was difficult to breathe without respirators. Along the narrow corridor, there were 3 doors made of thick boards with small windows for food. The first cell was empty. In the second, there was only an old mattress covered with mold. When the officer opened the third door, the flashlight beam caught a human figure in the corner. The woman was sitting on the dirt floor, with her hands on her knees and her face hidden. She was dressed in rags that had once been expensive tourist clothes. It was Sherry Green. The woman's condition shocked even the experienced paramedics who came down after the assault team. She was critically dehydrated. Her skin was covered with ulcers, bruises, and marks from numerous beatings. Sherry did not respond to her name. When the light of the flashlight touched her face, she began to make sounds similar to the whimpering of a wounded animal and put her palms over her eyes, trying to hide from the brightness she had not seen in months. She was psychologically broken. Her mind, unable to withstand the torture and isolation, hid deep inside, leaving only primitive instincts of fear. The doctors carefully put her on a stretcher, trying not to cause unnecessary pain, and began to raise her to the surface. But the joy of the rescue quickly gave way to anxiety. Rose Washington was not in the basement. The commandos checked every corner of the dungeon, tapped the walls in search of hiding places, but the third participant of the trip disappeared without a trace. In the cells, they found only chains, bowls of dried food, and a bucket that served as a toilet. It became apparent that 2 women were being held there, but one of them had been taken away earlier. Detective Mark Sullivan, who was leading the operation on the ground, felt a chill run down his spine. He ran out of the barn and headed for the patrol car where Karen Williams was being held. The woman was sitting in the back seat, looking out the window at the agent's bustle with the same indifferent expression on her face. Sullivan abruptly opened the door and, without saying a word, held up his phone to her face with the photo he had found in the trash yesterday. On the screen was an exhausted Rose in a hole, and behind her was Karen with a shovel. Karen's reaction was so calm that it bordered on insanity. She slowly turned her gaze from the screen to the detective, her eyes clear and empty. There was no fear or pity in her voice, just a cold statement of fact, as if she were talking about a damaged item, not a person she had been friends with for 10 years. Rose was not cleansed, she said quietly. Her ego was too strong. She clung to the past, to her futile life in a world of lies. She refused to accept Silas's gift. We returned her to the land. She became part of the roots. These words sounded like a sentence. In that moment, the puzzle finally came together in a horrifying picture. Karen Williams was not a victim forced to join a cult under pressure. She was a predator. This entire purification campaign was a carefully planned recruitment operation. She used her friends' trust to lure them into a trap. In the hierarchy of the Rooted Path sect, the status of an adept depended on the number of fresh souls brought in. Karen sought to rise higher, to become closer to the leader, and for this, she offered the lives of 2 of her closest people to Silas Vance. She didn't just watch them suffer. She was the architect of their hell. Sullivan slammed the car door shut, trying to contain his rage. The words, "returned to her land," could mean only one thing. He looked around the sanctuary grounds, at the fields where the men in gray had been working an hour ago, and at the forest that was coming up to the fence. Somewhere out there, in the cold ground of Blacksburg County, lay the answer to the last question of this investigation. And the detective realized that they had no time left to save Rose Washington. Now they only needed to find the place where her earthly journey ended. Immediately after Sherry Green was found in the barn dungeon, the situation on the sanctuary's territory entered the phase of emergency medical evacuation. The woman was in a state of deep shock. Her vital signs were critical. Her pulse was barely palpable, and dehydration had reached the point where her internal organs were beginning to fail. The paramedics working at the scene decided not to wait for ground transportation. At 7 o'clock, 40 minutes in the morning, a rescue helicopter landed on the lawn in front of the main house. Sherry was loaded on board to the howl of the turbines, and in a few minutes the air vehicle disappeared behind the treetops, heading for Carillion Roanoke Medical Center. Doctors in the intensive care unit were already preparing the intensive care unit, realizing that the fight for the life of the only witness would be long and difficult. Meanwhile, an eerie silence reigned at the silent farm itself, broken only by the clicks of forensic cameras and short commands on the radio. The federal agents began methodical work with the commune's population. 24 people in gray clothes who had been taken out of the barracks sat on the grass, surrounded by officers. They were not criminals, but broken dolls. Most of them were under the influence of strong psychological suggestion, and some were probably under the influence of drugs. They looked at the agents with blank eyes, muttering memorized phrases about cleansing and going to the roots. The detectives realized that time was running out. Rose Washington had not yet been found. The hope that she was alive was melting away with every passing minute, but they needed a body. The breakthrough came at 11 o'clock in the morning. One of the younger members of the sect, a 25-year-old man named Jacob, who had joined the commune only 6 months earlier, could not withstand the pressure of reality. When the FBI agent showed him Rose's photo and asked where she was, Jacob began to shake and cry. Through his tears, he pointed toward the woods, behind an old tool shed where fertilizer and gardening tools were stored. His words, recorded in the interrogation report, sounded like a sentence. "It's there, where the ground is fresh. She made her own bed." The forensic team immediately set off in the direction indicated. Behind the barn, in the dense bushes of wild raspberries, the ground did look disturbed. The layer of fallen leaves was uneven, and the soil was loose and darker than the surrounding area. The dog handler led the dog to the suspicious spot, and the dog instantly gave a signal by sitting down at the edge of a barely visible hill. The experts marked the perimeter with yellow tape and started digging. It didn't take them long. At a depth of 3 feet, the shovel hit something soft. When the layer of earth was carefully removed, the investigators saw a horrifying scene. In a shallow hole, the body of a woman lay curled up in a ball. It was Rose Washington. She was wearing the remains of the same rags that the detectives had seen in the phone photo. Her hands were tied behind her back with a coarse rope, and a heavy, rusty chain still hung around her neck, cutting into her skin. The body had not yet undergone severe decomposition, indicating a recent death. A preliminary examination on the spot by the medical examiner, followed by a full autopsy at the morgue, established the exact time of death. Rose Washington died on October 18, 2015. This happened just 2 days before the storming of the sanctuary. This information hit the investigators harder than anything else. They were only 48 hours late. If the phone had been turned on earlier, if the search had begun at least a day earlier, Rose could be in the hospital with Sherry right now. The cause of death was no less horrific. Experts found a massive head injury in the back of her head caused by a blunt, heavy object, presumably a stone or shovel butt. However, the immediate cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation, strangulation. She was killed in a brutal and cold-blooded manner, with no chance of rescue. The discovery of the body allowed detectives to fully reconstruct the events of the last days of Rose's life and solve the mystery of the photograph. Testimonies from other members of the sect confirmed the worst guesses. The photo found on the phone was not just a means of intimidation. It was a documentary report. Karen Williams took this picture to show cult leader Silas Vance that preparations for the execution were going according to plan. Rose Washington was forced to dig her own grave. The exhausted, sick woman spent hours throwing earth, kneeling in the hole that was to become her last resting place, while her former best friend watched through the camera lens, capturing a moment of complete exhaustion and resignation. But one question remained. Why turn on the phone and throw it away so that the police could find it? The answer lay in the psychology of the sect leader. During the interrogations of people close to Silas, it turned out that this was part of his perverse game. Silas Vance, possessing manic narcissism, felt that his empire was attracting too much attention. Instead of laying low, he decided to provoke an endgame. He believed in his invulnerability and divine destiny. Turning on Rose's phone was a challenge. Vance ordered one of his henchmen to take the device to Newcastle and activate it to lead the police to the gates of the sanctuary. He wanted the world to see his creation, his power over life and death. For him, the storming by the special forces was not a defeat, but the culmination of his teachings, the final test of faith for his followers. He sacrificed Rose as waste material that could not be processed, and used her death as a signal for the beginning of the end. As Rose Washington's body was packed in a black bag and loaded into the coroner's car, the sun began to set behind the Cove mountain range, casting long shadows on the dug-up ground behind the barn. Detective Sullivan stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at the empty grave. Now they had all the evidence: the body, the murder weapon, the crime scene, and the witnesses. But the main mystery remained unsolved. How exactly did three intelligent, modern women fall into this trap a year ago? What happened on that fateful day on the Dragon's Tooth Trail when their friendship turned into a death sentence? Only one person could give the answer to this: Sherry Green, who was now fighting for her life in the intensive care unit and whose memory kept the most terrible details of this tragedy. On October 23, 2015, 3 days after the storming of the sanctuary, the first words of the main witness were heard in the sterile silence of the intensive care unit of the Carillion Roanoke Medical Center. Sherry Green, who had been literally pulled from the dead by doctors, regained consciousness for the first time and agreed to speak to Detective Mark Sullivan. Her voice was weak, like the rustle of dry leaves, and her throat was burning from the IV tubes, but her memory, unlike her body, preserved every second of the hell she had to go through. During 4 hours of continuous recording, she told the story not of a kidnapping, but of the worst betrayal imaginable. According to Sherry's testimony, the events of October 15, 2014, did not develop in the way the investigation had assumed. The group did not get lost and did not meet a maniac in the forest. Everything went according to plan, but it was the plan of only one person: Karen Williams. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, when the women had overcome the most difficult part of the climb to Dragon's Tooth, Karen suddenly stopped. She told her friends that she knew a secret spot, a hidden viewpoint with an incredible view that tourists don't know about and where they could take the best sunset photos. Rose and Sherry, trusting their friend, agreed to turn off the marked trail. Karen confidently led them through the dense brush, down the slope, to an old, mossy logging road. The women walked down for almost an hour, joking and discussing plans for the evening. But when the forest parted, instead of a panoramic view of the valley, they saw a rusty pickup truck parked in a dead end. 2 men with guns were standing next to the vehicle. Sherry recalled that at that moment she was not afraid, thinking they were rangers or hunters. She looked back at Karen, expecting to see surprise or fear on her face. But Karen was smiling. It was the moment of truth that Sherry described with a tremor in her voice. Karen did not run, did not scream. She calmly walked up to the armed men, hugged one of them, and took the plastic ties from the back of the pickup truck. She then turned to her friends, who were numb with shock, and ordered them to kneel. When Rose tried to resist and asked what was happening, Karen slapped her in the face so hard that she fell. "It's for your own good," she said. "I'm giving you a chance to be saved." It was Karen, not the men, who tightened the plastic nooses around her best friend's wrists, forever ending a decade of friendship. Further life in the sanctuary turned into an endless nightmare. Sherry said that they were not just held as slaves, they were tried to be re-educated. Silas Vance, the leader of the sect, created a system where physical labor was combined with psychological torture. Women were forced to work 18 hours a day, carrying stones, digging trenches, cultivating the land with their bare hands. But the worst were the night sessions. These were hours-long interrogations, during which victims were forced to confess to fictitious sins such as envy, pride, and wishing evil to others. Karen Williams took an active part in this torture. She was not a prisoner. She became a warden. In order to prove her loyalty to the leader and rise in the cult's hierarchy, she used her knowledge of her friends against them. She knew all their childhood fears, all their complexes, all their secrets, and she ruthlessly pressed on the most painful points. Sherry recalled how Karen would stand over them with cold water or a stick, demanding more and more confessions, calling it an act of love, and cleansing the soul of the dirt of civilization. She enjoyed her power, transforming from a quiet yoga instructor into a fanatical sadist. Rose Washington never broke down. She was the only one who continued to resist despite starvation and beatings. During this year, she tried to escape 3 times. The first time, she was caught by dogs near the fence. The second time, she was betrayed by another prisoner hoping for an extra portion of food. The third attempt was fatal. Rose managed to saw through a board in the barrack floor and get out during a thunderstorm. But Karen, who knew her friend's habits, predicted her route and was waiting for her at the exit of the forest. Sherry witnessed what happened after the third escape. It was a trial held by Silas Vance in the main barn. Rose, beaten and bound, was thrown into the center of the circle. Vance asked the congregation what to do with the rotten branch that refused to take root on the tree of faith. Everyone was silent, eyes downcast. Then Karen stepped forward. She looked at her former friend, with whom she had shared a room in college, and passed judgment without a shadow of regret. "She doesn't deserve to be among us," Karen said. "She's poisoning the soil. She needs a final cleansing." It was Karen who suggested that Rose be buried, having previously made her dig a hole for herself so that the earth would accept her sacrifice. Sherry survived only because she chose a different path. She completely submitted. She broke her personality, becoming a shadow, a silent doll that followed any orders. She dug, carried, prayed, and thanked her torturers for every piece of bread. She saw Karen taking pictures of Rose in the pit, saw her being led to the execution, but she did not say a word. Her fear of death was stronger than her friendship and dignity. Sherry Green's confession became the foundation on which the district attorney built the prosecution. Now the investigation had a complete picture of the crime, the motives, and, most importantly, direct evidence of Karen's complicity in the murder. From Sherry's words, it became clear that Karen was the main driver of this horror, the initiator of the torture, and Rose's actual executioner. But there was one more, final stage of this drama ahead. The trial promised to be no less tense than the investigation itself, because Karen Williams, even while sitting in a detention center cell, continued to believe in her innocence. She was preparing her last speech, which was supposed to shock the jury, and Sherry Green would have to look into the eyes of the woman who had killed her soul long before the police opened the basement door. On January 11, 2016, the Roanoke County Courthouse was surrounded by a tight ring of reporters and television vans. The case of the Sanctuary of the Evergreens stirred up not only the state of Virginia, but the entire country. People demanded answers. How could a concentration camp disguised as an eco-settlement exist in the 21st century, right under the noses of the authorities? Silas Vance was the first to go to trial. The sect leader refused the services of public defenders and decided to represent himself, turning the court hearings into a grotesque one-man show. He tried to use the rostrum not to defend himself, but to preach, telling the jury for hours about the path to the roots, purification through pain, and the light that cannot be extinguished. Vance was defiant, interrupting the judge and calling prosecutors blind servants of the system. However, his charisma, which so easily broke the will of his exhausted captives in the forest, was shattered by the ironclad evidence in the courtroom. The prosecution presented the court with the leader's personal diaries found in his office during the search. In these records, he described in detail, with sadistic pleasure, the methods of psychological breakdown of each victim, calling them material for experiments. But the most terrifying evidence was the video footage seized from the sanctuary's surveillance cameras. The jury saw not spiritual practices, but scenes of brutal beatings, humiliation, and starvation. When footage appeared on the screen of Vance personally beating Sherry Green with a stick for insufficient obedience, the room fell silent. The verdict was announced on February 20, 2016. The judge, without concealing his disgust, read out the decision. Life imprisonment without parole, plus 40 years for organizing a criminal group and kidnapping. Silas Vance greeted the verdict with laughter, saying that the walls of the prison would not be able to hold his spirit. But the guards rudely escorted him out of the room, putting an end to the story of the prophet. The trial of Karen Williams, which began in March, was much more complicated and dramatic. Her defense chose the strategy of victim of circumstances. The lawyers insisted that Karen herself was a victim of brainwashing, that she was acting under the influence of psychotropic substances and Vance's hypnotic suggestions. They painted a portrait of a weak, intimidated woman who only followed orders out of fear for her own life. This tactic began to work. Some jurors nodded sympathetically as they looked at the frail figure of the defendant, who was crying all the time and holding a handkerchief. The turning point came during cross-examination. The state prosecutor, realizing that the case was falling apart, decided to go all in. He walked up to Karen and put the same phone photo he had found in the trash in front of her. The picture showed an exhausted Rose in her grave, and behind her was a smiling Karen with a shovel. "Ms. Williams," the prosecutor asked, looking her in the eye, "when you took this photo, were you crying? Were you afraid of Silas? Or did you feel like you were doing a great thing?" At this point, the victim's mask fell off. Karen stopped sobbing. She straightened up, her gaze cold and hard as steel. She looked at the photo of her dead friend, not with horror, but with a kind of sick tenderness and pride. "I wasn't afraid," she said clearly in the absolute silence of the room. "I felt proud. I was saving her. Rose was weak, clinging to her insignificant ego. I gave her a chance to become a part of eternity. I was her guide. It was an act of the highest love." These words came as a bolt from the blue. The jury, who had been ready to acquit her a moment ago, recoiled. In Karen's eyes, they saw not remorse, but fanatical devotion to the ideas of the killer. She was not a victim. She was an ideological executioner. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and torture. The judge sentenced Karen Williams to life in prison. When she was led out of the courtroom, she did not look at her parents, who were crying in the front row. She looked for Sherry Green, but she was not in the room. Sherry Green was not present at the announcement of the verdict. After being discharged from the hospital, she returned to her parents' house in a quiet suburb. Her physical wounds have healed, but the scars on her soul remain forever. She undergoes a long and painful rehabilitation course, learning to trust people again and sleep without lights. Sherry never goes hiking again. Even the sight of a city park causes her to have panic attacks. She lives a sheltered life, trying to erase the years she spent in hell. But every night in her dreams, she sees the rusty pickup truck and her best friend's smile again. Today, years after the tragedy, in the Virginia State Police evidence room, on a shelf under the letter B, there is a small transparent bag labeled Exhibit 489. Inside is a white iPhone 5 smartphone in a silicone case. Its battery is long dead, and the screen remains black and cold. But everyone who picks up this package knows what horror is hidden in its digital memory. This phone has become a mute witness to a betrayal that cost one woman her life and destroyed the fate of another. And far from here, on the ridge of Cove Mountain, the wind continues to walk between the sharp rocks of Dragon's Tooth. Hikers climb to the top again, take selfies against the sunset and laugh, unaware of what is hiding in the thick shadows below. Jefferson Forest retains its majestic beauty. But for those who know the story of Rose, Sherry, and Karen, these views are forever tainted with blood, and a secret that has been hiding in the thicket for a year. And although the perpetrators have been punished and the case closed, it sometimes seems that the echoes of the footsteps of those who never returned home still wander among the old trees, reminding us that the darkest monsters are not in the woods, but in human souls.